Music theory with OneNote. Modal ocean chord inversions. Building inverted chords, this time from notes that are anchored in, from our Earth analogy, the 5 oceans. In other words, building chords off of notes that are not in the 7-note collection. From a modal perspective, those would be the node points 1.5, or the Ionian Ocean or Ionian Sharp, 2.5, the Dorian Ocean or Dorian Sharp, 4.5, the Lydian Ocean or Lydian Sharp, 5.5, the Mixolydian Ocean or Mixolydian Sharp, and finally 6.5, the Aeolian Ocean or Aeolian Sharp. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 1391, OneNote Modal Ocean Chord Inversions. List of presentations on the right-hand side. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation, or multiple presentations, where we actually build these tables out in Excel, practicing not only our musical skills, but our Excel formatting skills as well. We're going to still be looking at the naming of chords, focusing in on the inversions, building chords off of what we're calling the ocean notes, those outside of the 7-note collection. Now, if we use the standard convention, this table would cover the extensions typical to those chords built off of the notes in the 7-note collection. But as we've seen in prior presentations, it doesn't give you the context, which becomes a problem. However, you might say, well, at least this naming convention would still cover the notes that are going to be in the ocean, which is true. But again, it doesn't really give you the information that you would like in relation to the context of the song. So in other words, our normal naming convention has like a major bucket, which you would think would be chords built off of the Ionian node, but also includes chords built off of the Mixolydian node and Lydian node, until you run into the point where those two don't fit anymore, which for the Mixolydian happens right when you add the 7, and so on. We have the minor bucket, which you would think would be all of the Aeolian chords, but it's not, because when you add the 13 for the Aeolian, you have an extension over here problem. And then you would think it would be the same for the Dorian, which does fit in there beautifully. And then the Phrygian has problems that we need extensions for. And then we have the dominant 7 bucket, which handles the problem of the Mixolydian chords after the first triad, because the 7th is an issue. Then we have the diminished and half diminished buckets, which had to both be put in place to deal with chords built off of the Locrian. And then the extensions get dumped over here when we have the extensions on the major and the minor. So that is ugly, because it doesn't tell you anything about the relative position to the context of the song. That's what becomes kind of a problem. Now, if we visualize the fretboard here, this is going to have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, on top. The colored notes are those in the collection of notes around the C major. So if I was to build, say, an A chord in this collection of notes, I would like to call it something by the node, which would be the Aeolian node. So it would be an Aeolian chord, 3-note Aeolian chord, 4-note Aeolian chord, and so on and so forth. That works beautifully, because it gives you the actual context of not just it's a minor, but I'm building off of this particular node, telling you where it would be in the song, where it would be in the shape on the fretboard. But you're going to say, well, the reason they don't do that is because of these ocean notes, because then if you build a chord off of this node, you wouldn't have any way to name it. Now, that's not true. Because you can still name it in relative position to the collection of notes that you are in by naming that nodal point. If this is nodal point number 6, this would be nodal point 6.5, right? Or you can call it the Aeolian Ocean, an Aeolian Sharp, if you would like to call it that. And that's going to be more useful because that will tell you it's an indication that it's outside the collection of notes. Something, by the way, that normal sharps and flats do not, right? The normal sharps and flats aren't efficient, and we've eliminated them for note names. Why? Because those sharps and flats only tell you that you're outside the collection of notes of the key of C and related modal points. That's not helpful because I want to play in all 12 collections of 7 notes. Whereas if you use this technique, the sharps are there to tell you this is the perspective that we're looking in. One of the 12 collections of 7 notes, the 5 notes that are going to be the modal point sharp are then going to give you the points that are in the ocean. We're not going to give them 2 names. I'm not going to give them a flat and a sharp, in other words, because I still want one naming convention, which could either be named by number, which would be in this case 6.5, this case 1.5, Ionian Ocean, or by letter and sharp, right? So that we only have one name for them. But kind of like the sharps and flats when you're playing in the key of C, the same idea will be here, but it'll work for all 12 collections of 7 notes because we're looking at it from a relative perspective depending on the collection of notes that we're in, giving us context about the song. So then once we have that, when I name that, I could say, look, this is going to be an Aeolian sharp chord, but I also have to tell you what the shape of it could be because it might not be an Aeolian shape. The Aeolian shape would be the number of notes that have a modal half steps and modal whole steps from this node. If I'm over here, then notice that I can't really see the shape the same way because I'm playing a chord that's outside the collection of notes. So I could just name the shape. It's going to be a 6.5 or an Aeolian sharp, but maybe it has an Ionian shape, or maybe it has a Dorian shape, or maybe just major and minor, which is Ionian and Aeolian. And that will give you context because then it might lead into this note here, for example, and it'll tell you that I'm building a chord off of a note that's outside the collection, which gives you an idea of why I might be doing that. Once you have that structure, then of course you could do the same naming convention for the inversions by just then naming it's a first inversion, second inversion, up to 6 inversions if it was a 7-note chord. So let's just go through those. I'll show you what I mean. So we did these inversions basically last time for the standard chords built off of the 7-note collection. Ionian would be a C major 13/E if it was a 7-note Ionian and it was a first inversion. It would be easier to call it a 7I/1 or an I6/1 for 7-note Ionian first inversion or an Ionian 6-modal whole step first inversion, and so on and so forth. You can see that you get these very ugly names here, like this naming convention for Phrygian is a complete mess. It's a lot cleaner and a lot more succinct. Again, someone who's trying to argue for the traditional method would say, well, yeah, that's great, but you don't have anything to do with the ones that are in the ocean. Well, no, that's easy. You can still look at the ocean notes just as you probably do when you play something, meaning you're still going to play the oceans as relative positions, right? So I'm going to say this is going to be the Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean, which from a naming convention would be 1.5, and it would always be 1.5 for all 12 collections of 7 notes. If I was to build a chord, then if it was let's say we're going to build an Ionian chord off of that nodal point. What I'm going to do is say, well, that's going to be a C sharp or a D flat. That's what this CD stands for, so that it could be either one. That's what I mean by the CD format here. And then it's going to be a major 13/E/F, I should say. So notice that major 13, you might say, well, look, that major 13 works beautifully because I could still use that naming convention because I'm naming by the note name. And it's like, well, that's true, but it doesn't really give you any context about whether it fits in the song or not, right? If I use that, I can't transpose it, and it's going to confuse someone if you don't tell them what key the song is in, because they're going to look at that and say, well, is that inside the key or outside the key? You got to kind of figure that out. And we have the slash here with the same problem, naming the note point, instead of the relative position or scale degree. That means it's not going to be transferable. And we have the note name up front, which means it's not transferable. So the other way you could do it is to say it's going to be a 7-note Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean, meaning that's the node that we're going to be building, and then give me the shape of it, meaning in this case it's going to be an Ionian shaped chord, meaning a major shaped chord, and then give me the inversion /1, the inversion meaning that's going to be one modal whole step up. Or it's going to be an Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean, meaning one step up from the Ionian node, a 1.5 modal point chord. It's going to be 6 modal whole steps, and then again the shape is Ionian /1 for the first inversion. So if I go over here, that just means that we're going to invert the first one up. Now the problem we have here is that I can't really count in modal whole steps, as we saw in a prior presentation when we just looked at the chords in general before the inversions. Why? Because the normal convention would say, look, if I'm going to be on this point, I'm just going to make that CD as though I shifted the entire shape up and just call it 1 in the scale degree, so that I then have 1, 3, the 1, 3, 5, and so on to build the chord. But that forces me outside of the key that I'm in just to build the chord, which I don't want to do. The normal thing we could do not to pull us out of the key is to say I'm going to name it by modal half steps and modal whole steps to build it. But if you're building off of a note that's outside the key, then you can't really count in modal half steps and whole steps. You really have to count like in just normal half steps. Now again, in practice, what do? You just know the shape. You're just saying, oh, it's a C shape that I'm building off of this node that's outside the collection of 7 notes, and you just grab the shape, and then you know that the second note in the shape standard would be the point or the lowest inversion, right? So it kind of makes it's easy in practice, but when you want to actually count it out, that's when it gets kind of ugly. But note that if you count in half steps in relative position and wanted to put it into a computer like a DAW, then it would be very easy to do because again, you can count it out. You just count it out basically in half steps. All right, so then the next one is going to be if I wanted let's say I wanted to have a Dorian shape. So I'm still on the Ionian ocean or Ionian sharp node, the 1.5 node, the one that's outside the collection, but I want to build not just a minor chord, which would be an Aeolian, right, but a Dorian on it because I have a more specific need for a Dorian-shaped chord there for whatever reason. Well, normally you would just say, okay, that's going to be still a C sharp D flat minor 13 / and then the inversion is going to be a second inversion, which happens to be in this collection of notes a G sharp or an A flat. It would be nicer because again, I can't tell by that name that this chord is outside the collection of notes, and I have to decide if I'm going to use a sharp or a flat for C sharp and D flat, and whether I use a sharp or a flat for G sharp or A flat, which is kind of a mess. Why would I need to deal with that mess? I don't want 2 names for one note and whatnot, so it would be nicer to say it's a 7 I sharp D /2 or an I sharp 6 D /2 standing for it's a 7-note Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean chord, and I'm going to build on that nodal point a Dorian shaped chord, and then /2 for the second inversion, meaning you go 2 modal whole steps up from the standard convention of the chord shape, and that's the point of inversion, meaning that's going to be the lowest node in the chord, lowest note. Or it's an Ionian sharp 6 modal whole step, then Dorian shape /2 for the second inversion. So then of course we could say, okay, I'm on the same node. It's a D sharp, it's a C sharp or D flat. It's an Ionian ocean chord, but maybe I want to build on it a Phrygian shape. That's another minor shape, which would normally just be Aeolian if it was a triad. But if you're getting more detailed about the shape, you can say it's a Phrygian shape to give you that flavor of the Phrygian that has one interval different than the Aeolian, right? So normally that would be a C sharp minor flat 13, flat 9 if it was a 7-note chord, and then slash B would be the inversion point. So that's an ugly chord name in and of itself. Note that under normal naming convention, you have to kind of memorize that weird name would be for a chord that is standard, that's in the collection of notes. In other words, you would think that you would only have this kind of weird name if you're building a chord that is not all out of like one collection of notes, meaning you're building it out of something that has the 7 notes in the collection and something that's in the ocean, or not all 7 notes. You have some notes in a particular 7-note collection, and you're pulling some notes that are kind of like outside the collection. But no, this one would be as though we were in the C sharp or D minor collection of notes relative to the Phrygian of a C sharp or D minor, and you still have that ugly name. It would be nicer to say it's a 7 I sharp P/3 or an I sharp 6 P/3 4. It's a 7-note Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean, a 1.5 nodal chord that has a Phrygian shape /3 for the third inversion, meaning you're going 3 modal points up, and that's the lowest note in the chord. Or an I sharp 6 modal whole step chord with a Phrygian shape /3 for the third inversion. So then we could be on the same node. It's going to be an Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean, but we want to build a Lydian shape. Normally that would be a C sharp or D flat major 13 sharp 11/D E for the D sharp or E flat, because that would be the inversion point. It would be nicer to say it's a 7 I sharp Y/4 or I sharp 6 Y/4 for 7-note Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean nodal point with a Lydian shape, fourth inversion, go 4 nodes up, and that's the lowest note. Or I sharp 6 modal whole step Lydian shape, fourth inversion. So then we have the next one. We want to build a Mixolydian shape on the same point. That would be a C sharp or D flat 13/F sharp or G flat, which would be nicer to say it's a 7 I sharp X/5 or I sharp 6 X/5 for a 7-note Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean Mixolydian shape /5th inversion, meaning go 5 nodal points up and perform the inversion there. Or an Ionian sharp 6 modal whole step Mixolydian shape /5th inversion. And then finally, we could also have a same nodal point, meaning Ionian sharp, Ionian ocean, but we're going to build an Aeolian shape, which would be the second standard shape if you're looking at triads. If I was just building a 3-note chord, then I could just use Ionian and Aeolian, because all of the other modal points except Locrian are going to come up with the same shape. It's only when I want to get the more variation that I would need the other nodal kind of shapes, right? So I would normally call that a C sharp or D flat minor flat 13/A, but it would be better to say it's going to be a 7 I sharp A/6 or I sharp 6A/6 for 7-note Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean nodal point, Aeolian shape, minor shape in other words, and invert on the 6 modal whole step up. Or you can say it's going to be an Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean 6 modal whole step Aeolian shape, and once again invert on the 6. Then we could have a Locrian shape on the same node. So that would be a C sharp or D flat half diminished 13, which happens to be the lowest note, an A, but it would better be called a 7 I sharp N/6 or an I sharp 6 N/6 for a 7-note Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean chord that has a Locrian shape, N standing for Locrian, 6th inversion, goes 6 modal whole step up. That will be the lowest note in the chord. Or an Ionian sharp or Ionian ocean 6 modal whole step chord with a Locrian shape and then 6th inversion. Now, if we're on the Lydian Ocean, same thing, obviously. So I'll go through this a little bit more quickly, but now we're on the Lydian Ocean, which would be nodal point 4.5. So if I was to build 7-note chords off of that, then I can say, okay, if I was on the Lydian Ocean and I want to build an Ionian chord off of it, then the normal name would be an F sharp or G flat major 13, because we're just building a 7-note chord off of that nodal point. But that doesn't tell me that I'm outside the collection of notes. And again, we get these two names for one note, both on the nodal point as well as the inversion point. So / A sharp or B flat. It would be nicer to call it a 7 Lydian sharp, or it would be a 7 Y sharp I/1 or Y sharp 6 I/1 for a 7-note Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean point with an Ionian shape, which is a major shape, /1 or first inversion, meaning go one modal whole step up and make that the lowest note. Or it's going to be a Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean 6 modal whole step chord with an Ionian shape /1 for the inversion point. So if we do the next one, this would be, we're going to do the inversion on the same Lydian Ocean, but we want to make a Dorian shape, which is a type of minor shape. So that would be normal name F sharp, G flat, minor 13 / C sharp or D flat, but we can call it a 7 Y sharp D/2 or Y sharp 6 D/2 for a 7-note Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean with a Dorian shape /2, meaning go 2 modal whole steps up, and that'll be the lowest note or point of inversion. Or it's going to be a Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean 6 modal whole step chord with a Dorian shape /2nd inversion. All right, next we have the same Lydian sharp, but we want to make a Phrygian shape, a type of minor shape. So normally that would be an F sharp, G flat, minor, flat 13, flat 9 /E, but we could call it a 7 Lydian sharp Phrygian /3 or a Lydian sharp 6 P/3 for a 7-note Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean with a Phrygian shape /3 for the 3rd inversion, meaning go 3 modal whole steps up from the root. That's the lowest note. Or it's going to be a Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean 6 modal whole step chord with a Phrygian shape /3 for the 3rd inversion. Then same thing on Lydian Ocean, but we have the 4th inversion and we want a Lydian shape. So it's a Lydian Ocean, so it's on Lydian sharp 4.5, which doesn't tell you the shape of the chord because it's on an ocean note, but we happen to be building a Lydian shape on it. So normally that would be an F sharp major 13 sharp 11 / and then it's going to be a G sharp or A flat. Better be called 7 Y sharp Y/4 or Y sharp 6 Y/4 for a 7-note Lydian Ocean or Lydian sharp with a Lydian shape /4 for the 4th inversion, meaning go 4 modal whole steps up, and that's the point of inversion. Or Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean 6 modal whole step with a Lydian shape 4th inversion. Then we could have a Lydian sharp but with a Mixolydian shape. Normally that would be an F sharp or G flat 13 /B, but we could call it a 7 Y sharp X/5 or Y sharp 6 X/5 for a 7-note Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean with a Mixolydian shape, and it's the 5th inversion, meaning going 5 nodes up, and that's the point of inversion. Or a Lydian sharp or Lydian Ocean 6 modal whole step Mixolydian shape, once again 5th inversion point. So then we have the same Lydian Ocean, but this time we're doing an Aeolian shape, which is the main minor shape, which is what we would typically use if we're just using a triad and it's a minor shape. Normally it'd be an F sharp or G flat minor flat 13 /D, but we could call it a 7 Y sharp A/6 or Y sharp 6 A/6, which stands for 7-note Lydian sharp or Lydian ocean with an Aeolian shape, sixth inversion, meaning going 6 modal whole steps up, making it the lowest note, the point of inversion, or it's going to be a Lydian sharp or a Lydian ocean, 6 modal whole step, Aeolian shape, 6th inversion. And finally, we could have a Lydian sharp point with a Locrian shape. Normally, that would be an F sharp or G flat, half diminished 13/D for the inversion of the 6th inversion. I'd rather call it a 7 Y sharp N/6 or a Y sharp 6 N/6 for a 7-note Lydian sharp or Lydian ocean with a Locrian shape /6th inversion, or a Lydian sharp or Lydian ocean modal point with a 6 modal whole step and the Locrian shape with a 6th inversion point. Mixolydian, so same thing, but this time we're on the Mixolydian node, right? So now we're on Mixolydian, which is going to be X sharp or nodal point 5.5, where we can just run the same thing. So we can say, okay, I'm on modal point Mixolydian ocean or 5.5, but I want to make an Ionian shape on it. Normally, we would call that, in the collection of notes around the key of C, the Mixolydian ocean or the 5.5 node happens to be a G sharp or an A flat. So I have to pick one. It's going to be a G sharp or A flat, major 13/G for the point of inversion. But it would be nicer to call it a 7 X sharp I/1 or X sharp 6 I/1. Why? Because it's a 7-note Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean. That's the nodal point and the number of notes in the chord, but we're going to make an Ionian shape on it, /1 for the first inversion, go 1 modal whole step up, that's the inversion point, or Mixolydian sharp, Mixolydian ocean, 6 modal whole step, distance to the last note with an Ionian shape, /1 for the inversion point. We could have a Mixolydian ocean, Mixolydian sharp point, but a Dorian shape. So then we're going to say that would normally be a G sharp or A flat minor 13/D sharp or E flat, but it would be better saying it's a 7 X sharp D/2 or X sharp 6 D/2 for 7-note Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean note with a Dorian shape, 2nd inversion going 2 modal whole steps up, making that the lowest note, point of inversion, or Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean, 6 modal whole step, distance to the last note. It's a Dorian shape, /2 2nd inversion. So next we could have a Mixolydian ocean, but a Phrygian shape. So that would be G sharp or A flat minor flat 13 flat 9 / F sharp or G flat. But we could call it a 7 X sharp P/3 or X sharp P, X sharp 6P/3 for 7-note Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean with a Phrygian shape, 3rd inversion, going 3 modal whole steps up, point of inversion, lowest note. Or Mixolydian sharp, Mixolydian ocean, 6 modal whole steps with a Phrygian shape, /3 3rd inversion. So then we could have then a Mixolydian ocean or sharp shape with a point with a Lydian shape. Normally, that would be a G sharp or A flat, major 13, sharp 11/A sharp or B flat, but we can call it a 7 X sharp Y/4 or X sharp 6/Y/4, which would be a 7-note Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean, Lydian shape, 4th inversion, meaning 4 modal whole steps up is the lowest note, point of inversion. Or Mixolydian sharp, Mixolydian ocean, 6 modal whole step, Lydian shape, 4th inversion. Then we have a Mixolydian ocean shape with a note with a Mixolydian shape. Remember that the Mixolydian point, Mixolydian sharp, is point 5.5. So although it's off the coast, you could say in our analogy, of the Mixolydian node, it doesn't tell us the actual shape that we're going to build on it. It's not really related to the Mixolydian shape because the Mixolydian shape is defined based on the continents, the notes that are in the collection, And this, by definition, is starting by a node that's off of that, right? That's why we could still call it a Mixolydian-shaped chord that's in the Mixolydian ocean, but not get that mixed up like as though the Mixolydian ocean means that it's going to have a Mixolydian shape, right? So anyways, that would be a G sharp or an A flat 13/C sharp or D flat, or a 7X sharp X/5 or X sharp 6X/5 for 7-note Mixolydian ocean, Mixolydian sharp with a Mixolydian shape, fifth inversion, meaning go 5 notes, modal whole steps up for the point of inversion, or Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean, 6 modal whole step with a Mixolydian shape /5. Then we could have a Mixolydian ocean with an Aeolian or minor shape, normally called a G sharp A flat minor flat 13/E. We can call it a 7X sharp A/6 or X sharp 6A/6 for a 7-note Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean nodal point with an Aeolian or minor shape to it /6 for the inversion point, inverting the note that's 6 modal whole steps up from the root, or a Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean nodal point, 6 modal whole step chord distance to the last note within it, Aeolian shape or minor shape /6 for the inversion point. And then finally we have a Mixolydian ocean chord with a Locrian shape, normally called a G sharp or A flat half diminished 13/E. We can call it a 7X sharp N/6 or X sharp 6N/6 for a 7-note Mixolydian sharp Mixolydian ocean with a Locrian shape, 6th inversion point, 6 modal whole steps up to get to the lowest note, putting it on the bass. We have, or we can call it a Mixolydian sharp or Mixolydian ocean, 6 modal whole step, distance to the last note with a Locrian shape, /6 being the inversion point. All right, Aeolian ocean. The Aeolian ocean would be nodal point 6.5, which in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be an A sharp or B flat. So we could then say, same thing, we can say, well, maybe it's going to be an Aeolian ocean, Aeolian sharp point that we're building off of, but that doesn't tell us anything about the actual shape because the shape is being defined by the collection of notes, and this one is outside the collection. Therefore, we can give it a shape and just say it's an Ionian shape. We're going to build an Ionian shape off of that nodal point. So that would normally be called an A sharp or B flat major 13/D, but that doesn't give me any context whether it fits in the song. It's not transferable. We have a confusion about the naming of it due to notes having 2 names for the A sharp and B flat, so it's a complete mess. Would be nicer to call it a 7A sharp I/1 or A sharp 6I/1 for a 7-note Aeolian or minor chord. I'm sorry, a 7-note Aeolian sharp for the modal point and number of notes with an Ionian shape /1 for the inversion, meaning invert 1 modal whole step up, or an A sharp or Aeolian ocean, 6 modal whole step distance to last note, and the shape is Ionian /1 for the point of inversion. We could have an Aeolian ocean 6.5 point, but we're building a Dorian shape 2nd inversion. Normally that would be called an A sharp or B flat minor 13/F. I would like to call it a 7A sharp D/2 or A sharp 6D/2 for 7-note Aeolian sharp or Aeolian ocean with a Dorian shape /2 2nd inversion, 2 modal whole steps up, that's the lowest note, or A sharp or Aeolian ocean, 6 modal whole step distance to last note with a Dorian shape and 2nd inversion. We could then say, what if it's an A sharp point, 6.5 point, but it has a Phrygian shape? Normally that would be an A sharp B flat minor flat 13 flat 9 / inversion point happens to land on a G sharp or A flat. Complete mess. Rather call it A 7A sharp P/3 or A sharp 6 P/3 for 7-note Aeolian sharp or Aeolian point that has a Phrygian shape, 3rd inversion, invert the note that's 3 modal whole steps up from the root, or an Aeolian ocean, Aeolian sharp, 6 modal whole step, distance to last note that is, Phrygian shape /3 for the point of inversion. Then we could have an Aeolian ocean with a Lydian shape. So that would normally be an A sharp, B flat, major 13, flat or sharp 11/C, but it would be nicer to call it a 7A sharp Y/4, A sharp 6 Y/4, so for a 7 note Aeolian sharp or Aeolian ocean with a Lydian shape. And fourth modal inversion, invert the note that's 4 modal whole step up from the root, in other words, or it's an A sharp Aeolian ocean, 6 modal whole step, distance to the last note with a Lydian shape /4 for the inversion point. Then we can have an Aeolian ocean chord with a Mixolydian shape. Normally that would be an A sharp or B flat 13/D sharp or E flat, but we can call it a 7A sharp X/5 or a sharp 6X/5 for a 7 note Aeolian ocean or Aeolian sharp nodal point with a Mixolydian shape with a 5th inversion, meaning we invert the note that's 5 modal whole steps up from the root. Or we can call it an Aeolian sharp or Aeolian ocean 6 modal whole step, which is the distance to the last note in the chord with a Mixolydian shape and a 5th inversion. So then we could have an Aeolian ocean or Aeolian sharp note with an Aeolian shape. So remember that we need the 2 Aeolians because the fact that it's in the Aeolian ocean or nodal point 6.5 doesn't really tell us anything about the shape. Doesn't mean it's going to be an Aeolian or minor shape because it's in the Aeolian ocean. It's in a point that's off of the grid in essence. So we'd rather call it it normally would be an A sharp or B flat minor flat 13/F sharp or G flat. I'd like to call it a 7A sharp A/6 or A sharp 6A/6 for a 7 note Aeolian ocean or Aeolian sharp with an Aeolian shape, 6th inversion, meaning we invert the note that's 6 modal whole steps up from the root. Or an Aeolian ocean, Aeolian sharp, 6 modal whole step, meaning that's the distance to the last note in the chord. Aeolian shape, minor shape, in other words, /6 for the 6th inversion point. Finally, we could have then an Aeolian ocean chord with a Locrian shape, normally called an A sharp or B flat half diminished 13/F sharp or G flat. Could rather call it a 7A sharp N/6 or A sharp 6 N/6 for a 7 note Aeolian sharp or Aeolian ocean chord with a Locrian shape, 6th inversion, meaning 6 modal whole steps up. That's the lowest note in the chord. Or it's an A sharp or Aeolian ocean, 6 modal whole step, distance to the last note in the collection, Locrian shape /6th inversion. Finally, we have the Dorian ocean. So the Dorian ocean would be nodal point 2.5, which in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be a D sharp or an E flat. So if we had a Dorian ocean, Dorian sharp with an Ionian shape, and it's a 7 note chord 1st inversion, that would be a D sharp or E flat major 13/E. I'd rather say it's going to be a 7D sharp I/1 or D sharp 6 I/1 for a 7 note Dorian sharp or Dorian ocean Ionian shaped chord 1st inversion, inverting the note 1 modal whole step up from the root. Or Dorian sharp or Dorian ocean 6 modal whole step, which is the distance to the last note in the chord, Ionian shape with a 1st inversion. We could have a Dorian ocean with a Dorian shape. Remember that the Dorian ocean is nodal point 2.5, doesn't tell us anything about the actual shape of the chord because we're building off something in the ocean. Therefore, if I want a Dorian chord off of the nodal point in the Dorian ocean, I have to name it. But we can normally call it a D sharp or E flat minor 13/A sharp or B flat. I would rather call it a 7D sharp D/2 or D sharp 6D, which is 7 note Dorian sharp or Dorian ocean chord with a Dorian shape, 2nd inversion, inverting the point that is 2 modal whole steps up from the root, that being the lowest note. Or it's a Dorian, well, this lost the slash. It's a Dorian ocean 6 modal whole step, Dorian shape slash. It should have a slash 2 there. Then we could have a Dorian ocean or Dorian sharp with a Phrygian shape. So that would be a D sharp, E flat, minor flat 13, flat 9 slash C sharp or D flat, but we could call it a 7 D sharp P slash 3 or 7 sharp or D sharp 6 P slash 3, which is a 7-note Dorian ocean or Dorian sharp chord with a Phrygian shape, 3rd inversion, inverting the nodal point. That's 3 modal whole steps up from the root. Or it's a D sharp or Dorian or ocean, 6th modal whole step, distance to the last note in the chord, which has a Phrygian shape, 3rd inversion. Then we have a Dorian ocean with a Lydian shape, normally called a D sharp or E flat, major 13, sharp 11 slash E. I'd rather see it as 7 D sharp Y slash 4 or D sharp 6 Y slash 4 for a 7-note Dorian ocean or Dorian sharp that has a Lydian shape, 4th inversion, meaning lowest note is 4 modal whole steps up from the root. It's on the bass. Or it's a D sharp or Dorian ocean 6 modal whole step, which is the distance to the last note in the chord with a Lydian shape slash 4 for the inversion point. We could have a Dorian ocean with a Mixolydian shape. Normally would be called a D sharp or E flat 13 slash G sharp or A flat, but we can call it a 7 D sharp X slash 5 or D sharp 6 X slash 5 for a 7-note Dorian ocean or Dorian sharp Mixolydian shape that has the 5th inversion, meaning lowest note is 5 modal whole steps up from the root. Or it's a Dorian ocean or Dorian sharp 6 modal whole step, distance to the last note in the chord with a Mixolydian shape and a 5th inversion. We could have a Dorian ocean chord with an Aeolian shape, meaning it's a minor shape on the 2.5 nodal point. So that would normally be a D sharp or E flat, minor 13, flat B. I'd rather see the 7 D sharp A slash 6 or D sharp 6 A slash 6 for a 7-note Dorian ocean or Dorian sharp with an Aeolian shape, 6th inversion, lowest note being 6 modal whole steps up from the root. Or a Dorian sharp or Dorian ocean 6 modal whole step, which is the distance to the last note in the chord, which has an Aeolian shape slash 6. Finally, we can have a Dorian ocean chord with a Locrian shape, normally called a D sharp or E flat, half diminished 13 slash B. I'd rather see a 7 D sharp N slash 6 or D sharp 6 N slash 6 for a 7-note Dorian ocean or Dorian sharp chord that has a Locrian shape and a 6th inversion, meaning the lowest note, the inversion point, being 6 modal whole steps up from the root. Or it could be a Dorian ocean, Dorian sharp with a 6th modal whole step, meaning that's the distance to the last note in the chord that has a Locrian shape and a 6th inversion point. All right, so I know these are the longest versions of the chords, but you get the idea of it. The 5 notes that are in the ocean, we can easily simply define them by defining the point that we're on and then the shape, giving the flavor of those shapes through the normal shapes that are the 5 chord shapes that are built off of the normal collections of notes, possibly mainly using only 2 of them, Ionian and Aeolian, for the most part when we're just working with triads, because those could be the default, like major and minor, as we just think about triad chords only needing the other 5 when we're getting more detailed about the flavor, but they are available and we can put them in place, and then we can just do the same inversion style, and that way we can get quite sophisticated in our naming conventions and still retain the uniformity and still be able to make everything written in a format that is completely transferable.